Welcome to Northrend, I'll be your guide. ZeteskRants. We start off in the middle of Dalaran with my red drake, acquired from the Wimrest Accord here. Dalaran is a floating city controlled by the Kirin Tor, which is an organization of mages. Long ago, before the invasion of the Orcs, Dalaran and the Kirin Tor were just a small human kingdom with slightly more open borders compared to other human kingdoms. During the events of Warcraft 3, Archimonde destroyed the city after being summoned by Kel'Thuzad under the service of Arthas and the first Lich King Ner'zhul. In the years afterward, it was rebuilt with magical barriers protecting it from the Wandering Scourge. Then, they lifted the city into the sky and brought it wherever they needed to go. It floated near Karazhan in the Eastern Kingdoms for a while, and went here to Crystal Song Forest during the campaign against Arthas the Lich King. We'll see it again in future videos, as it does travel around throughout the expansions. South of the city we can see Angrathar the Wrathgate. This is the site where Putris betrayed the Horde and launched plague gas into the Lich King's forces as well as the combined Horde and Alliance armies. Bolvar Fordragon was among those caught in the attack. The Red Dragons arrived to help by burning up the gas. By the time the players made it to the Lich King, Bolvar showed up to take the Helm of Domination from Arthas and use his will to make the undead forces of Northrend as docile as he could. Within the Helm, he would have to mentally combat the souls of Ner'zhul and Arthas, just like how Arthas had to spend years overcoming Ner'zhul's will to awaken the Scourge of Northrend. The gate is in Dragonblight, named for the graveyards of dragons and proto-dragons. As we fly around, we can spot the dragon shires of the different flights. Each flight stays near their domain element, which they were commanded to protect by the Titan Keepers when their founders were mutated from proto-dragons into what we now call dragons. The Black Obsidian Flight is responsible for the Deep Earth, the Red Ruby Flight protects life, the Blue Azure Flight protects magic, the Green Emerald Flight protects the Emerald Dream, and the Bronze Flight protects time. The Wimrest Accord is a coalition of all the flights, and they meet at Wimrest Temple whenever there is something that demands their combined attention. Below the temple are entrances to raids which have a few mounts that can drop. The path of the Titans is like a highway stretching the length of Dragonblight and cutting straight through the foundations of the temple. Perhaps before the Sundering when Northrend, Kalimdor, and the Eastern Kingdoms were still attached, it may have continued farther to connect other important places. On the southern coast is Moaki Harbour, the home of some Tuskar fishermen. Many of the species and factions in World of Warcraft were recycled from the previous games and books, and the Tuskar are no exception. Nearby we have some remnants of the still living Nerubians. Most of them were killed and resurrected in the war against Ner'zhul, but some did survive. Wintergrasp is an outdoor PvP area. As you can see, they don't do flying combat. Over the ledge we can see some of the Borean tundra, which has a floating necropolis, similar to the famous Naxxramas. Below it we can see some of the ziggurat designs altered from Warcraft 3 to reflect the larger size in comparison to troops. The goblins have made their mark on the landscape here. You can see the oil-covered wolves and deer in the scalding pools. There are some quests to fight against these Venture Co goblins. The Druids for the ethical and humane treatment of animals is a reference to Peter from real life. If you kill beast-type mobs in Borean Tundra, you get a debuff that says you're covered in animal blood and your character turns red until it wears off. If you go to the DEHTA camp with that debuff, they will attack you. There are more Tuskar nearby, and we can see some of their statues which seem like a reference to Easter Island statues from real life. I'm going to skip past the Alliance landing zone here and head out to the coast. There are some elven ruins as well as some Kavaldir. This coastline gives a fog effect on your camera while you are there, and I remember some quests finding lost people in the fog. The Kavaldir, in case you were wondering, are undead Vrykul, which are primordial versions of humans. You can find some Vrykul ancestors here still made of rock and metal, but most have already been infected with the curse of flesh which the old god Yogg Saron unleashed on the planet eons ago. The Horde base here is surrounded by Nerubian and spider enemies, which makes me wonder why they built it there. Or maybe those arachnids came out of the holes after the Horde tunneled down to get metal. The Nexus is home to some of the blue dragonflight. Their leader, Maligos, became corrupted with the whispers of the old gods when he thought his entire clutch and species had been eradicated 10,000 years ago during the Sundering. He wasn't told of the secret clutch of eggs being safeguarded, because the others didn't want him to become a second Deathwing and corrupt all his children. Later on, Kalegos takes command of the blue dragonflight, but struggles to unite the mostly solitary lone survivors across the planet. Just over the mountain is Winterfen village, where you can do quests for Murlocs, and collect clams to buy things from them. I like the variety of seeing the turtle and orca corpses lying around instead of having the Murlocs only feeding on small prey. We can still see their iconic hut architecture style though, so they do share their culture with Murlocs across Azeroth. The friendly Murlocs are on the opposite side of the river. Would you call this a river? It's the bit of water that separates an island from the main continent. The clam vendor is only unlocked once you've gotten far enough in the quest chain. Now if you look closely at King Murgle, you may notice he is a member of DEHTA, and has a zipper on his back. That's because he is actually a night elf in disguise. Pretty sweet costume, but his lucky Murlocs aren't too discerning. Down in the water here is where a lot of the clams are for the currency. I remember trying to do this on my old account before I hit max level for Northrend in 2009, and it was quite the trial avoiding enemies in three-dimensional space. The water and wind elementals around here have a few quests, and there's this landing strip which I was always afraid of when I was level appropriate, since it seemed to be an Alliance location. I vaguely remember going there as Alliance in 2009, but take that with a grain of salt. In the quarry, we see more of the Tuskar Easter Island style statues, some of which are being blasted with purple lightning apparently. There are some ghosts in the area you can interact with as part of a quest line. On the other side of the landing strip, there's a crashed necropolis that we can go inside. I've always liked how the abominations look. I remember from Warcraft 3, even though they were really low poly, they were my favorite of the tank-style mobs. Way better than the stone giants. Moving on to Sholazar Basin, there are a few pillars with different colored crystals. There is also a Titan portal which goes to Ungoro Crater, high up on a cliff somewhere, which I think was inaccessible until the portal was added. The same colorful crystals grow there, but in a much more haphazard style. Here they are mostly isolated to their own pillars. Below the canopy is a small village inhabited by Gorloks, a species related to Murlocs. When we get to Pandaria, we'll find the Jinyu, which are a more humanoid species related to both Gorloks and Murlocs. The Gorloks of Sholazar Basin are at war with the Frenzy Heart tribe of Wulvar, and the player can choose either side to join, regardless of your faction. I would still prefer to be able to befriend both sides, but that's just me. I never like choosing between different factions in video games. When I played Skyrim, I didn't choose a side in the Civil War until after I had gotten all the achievements from all the side content, and finished all the DLC. The choice between vampires and werewolves, I just went with whichever would allow me to get all the achievements on one save file, which if I recall correctly meant doing vampire first, then getting lycanthrope, then going full vampire after curing the lycanthrope. In World of Warcraft, since I can't save scum any of these faction choices, I just have multiple characters. So one character will go Frenzy Heart Wulvar and another will go Oracle Gorlok. I often check Wowhead to verify which faction has recipes for which professions before I make my choice of which character goes to which faction, and once I have one character do each faction, I don't bother with my other characters unless they need a certain crafting recipe. The River's Heart is a series of waterfalls that all pour down into a central lake. It was pretty annoying walking up and down the sides before I could afford cold weather flying back in the day. If I follow one of these rivers, we should get to Hemet Nesingwari. Apparently this wasn't the right river, but at least we can see what's going on above the rim of the zone. I like that there is actually stuff to do up here instead of it just being a barren clifftop like too many zone edges. Okay, now that I've found the correct river, you can see the Nesingwari expedition came in by ocean boat and wrecked on the waterfalls. Before I forget, let's take a short visit to the Frenzy Heart, so you can see their Wolverine-style anatomy up close. Well, not too close. The Titan overlooks around here really showcase that the Titan Keepers didn't bother getting involved in the events of mortals. They are here monitoring, but they don't care who lives or dies, or which kingdoms are just or unjust. This guy on the avalanche reminds me of some of the Moarg on Outland, but he is actually serving the Lich King. You can see some undead construct dogs nearby, and this foreshadows some of the bosses in the dungeons and raids later in the expansion. Before we get there, we'll circle around Jotunheim, the Vrykul location in the western coast of Icecrown. It really does look like a whole city with so many houses and multiple large castles. The sense of scale is something that this game struggles with at times. They don't want to make the map to scale for the lore, because no one wants to walk for an hour to get from the bank to the Zeppelin within a single city, and we don't want the trek from one city to another to be literal days of walking or riding ground mounts. Sometimes this limitation manifests as us seeing only a handful of houses at locations which are meant to be entire villages of hundreds of people. Other times it manifests as buildings being smaller than they are described as, or with sparser populations. Off the coast, the Scarlet Onslaught is here to attack the undead, and they'll execute any living person who mildly inconveniences them. We don't call them fanatics for their politeness and reasoning. The tower in the north here becomes an outpost for the Ebon Blade after a questline. The Ebon Blade are a faction of free undead, mostly Death Knights, who did not join Sylvanas and the Forsaken, but instead chose to be neutral to both Alliance and Horde. Part of the questline includes recruiting a few of the Scourge to join the Ebon Blade, which is nice. Too bad Sylvanas didn't make that her life's work after the fall of the Lich King Arthas. That would have been a nice epilogue to her character. More on that later. In the lower fields of Icecrown, there is a good variety of sizes for the undead. Some of these ghouls and skeletons are human-sized, others are much larger, and some are absolutely colossal. I think some of these might be dead of the same species as the Sons of Hodye, which I'll talk about more once we get to Storm Peaks. Somewhere under the Icecrown Citadel is a pit you can safely jump down into, which has water on the bottom and a remnant of Arthas' soul as a child. If you read the book about Arthas, it describes his mental battle against Ner'zhul and how his adult self kills the image of Ner'zhul as well as the image of his childhood self. Since this fragment survives, that leads me to think that a fragment of Ner'zhul still lurks around somewhere. Maybe in Northrend, maybe in the Shadowlands. When flying in southern Icecrown, I like that Dalaran is visible in the sky. Sometimes you get the Zeppelins loading in from thin air, but I think it is nicer when I can see a low polygon version of things in the distance. The Argent tournament was a training ground for the Horde and Alliance champions to prepare for the fight against Arthas. It was also my first experience with mounted combat in World of Warcraft. In modern times, there are all sorts of quests where you're piloting something and you have to use its attacks and abilities instead of your own health bar, mana, energy, or skills, but back when Northrend was new, so was this type of gameplay. It was interesting as the patches were released. At first there was nothing there, just an empty cliffside. Then piles of lumber and partial tents, for months on end, before the buildings finally arrived. I remember doing so many daily quests there on my old account. I haven't had the time to go back on my new account and redo all the pet and mount grinds. Up the cliff here is Storm Peaks. Look at the size of some of these metal things, they have scaffolding around them with regular-sized dwarves walking around. Ulduar is up here, and I remember it being a really mechanic-heavy raid. So many vehicle combat sections, and the red button to make one of the fights more difficult so you could get a rare chance at a mount. I got through the raid many times back in 2009 on my old account, but I never got the mount. Even nowadays when I can solo it, I still can't do some of the achievements. The Titan Keepers of Ulduar were inspired by Norse mythology, with Loken being Loki and Thorim being Thor. A recurring theme with Titan technology throughout many expansions is that their automation and programming didn't account for many variables, and they don't know how to respond against threats from old gods. The Titans were definitely arrogant to think they could protect the planets of the universe from the Void Lords and the old gods. Ulduar and the quests leading to it were my first introduction to Bran Bronzebeard, brother of Muradin. They have a third brother, Magni Bronzebeard, but I didn't figure that out until later, even though I had already handed in quests to him by that point in my game. Muradin spent most of his time with humans in Lordaeron. He was hired by King Terenas Menethil to tutor Arthas in sword fighting when he was just a child. After the culling of Stratham, when Arthas went to Northrend to hunt down Mal'Ganis, he found Muradin with a force of dwarves, stranded there awaiting rescue. Together they found Frostmourne, and Muradin warned Arthas not to take it because it was cursed. Arthas would gladly bear any curse to save his people, so he took up the blade, and a shard of ice from its tomb knocked Muradin unconscious and splattered blood on the snow. Arthas left him for dead. Let's backtrack a bit, because Muradin's predicament is actually an example of a wider trend in Warcraft 3 which I think has continued in the storytelling in World of Warcraft. He and dozens or maybe hundreds of dwarves serving the Alliance of Lordaeron were in search of ancient artifacts to bring back to the kingdom, either for power or for display in museums. Muradin mentions to Arthas that he was hoping for rescue, but Arthas didn't even know he was in Northrend. I think the Alliance abandoned the dwarvish expeditions. Similar abandonment of allies happened during the First Orc War, when Stormwind called for help and Lordaeron declined. Although that was before the official founding of the Alliance, the kingdoms were close trade partners at the time. Stromgarde acted as a border state and almost went extinct fighting against the orcs and trolls and ogres, without receiving any official aid from the other human kingdoms of the Alliance. When Lordaeron was sieged, the other kingdoms were going to abandon it, but Khadgar and a handful of military leaders defied their orders and went to break the siege. I also remember some debate in the books before they eventually agreed to rescue Khaz-Modan and Ironforge from the orcs. A few kingdoms were perfectly willing to let the dwarves die. The elves were also unwilling to send troops to actually support the alliance they had joined. If it weren't for Alaria Windrunner taking her own private army of rangers, they wouldn't have participated in the fight against the orcs except within their own borders in Quel'Thalas. During peacetime, Quel'Thalas, Gilneas, and Stromgarde resigned from the alliance. Gilneas even built a wall so they could ignore future wars. After the Scourge destroyed most of Lordaeron and Quel'Thalas, the Blood Elves rejoined the alliance, but were treated horribly, being used as frontline fodder or understaffed and left to die repeatedly. Prince Kael'thas eventually had to ally with the Naga to survive the Scourge, and the alliance was going to execute him for it if he didn't run away with Illidan and the Naga. Let's also not forget that Dalen Proudmoore took nearly the entire Alliance fleet to chase Thrall's free horde to Kalimdor, without any consideration for the will of the kingdoms of the Alliance. It isn't specifically stated, but I think this theft is what caused Kul Tiras to exit the Alliance and remain separate all the way up to the Battle for Azeroth expansion decades later. Basically what I'm saying is the Alliance has a habit of saying no to its member states when they ask for help, and the undertones of racism and species ISM are very loud. But I digress. I was talking about Muradin, Bran, and Magni, the three brothers Bronzebeard. Muradin did not actually die when Arthas left him at Frostmourne's pedestal. He was rescued by Frostborn dwarves and used the name Yorg Stormheart until the player finds him and gets him to remember some of his past. Bran never had any interest in war or politics, he just wanted to explore and excavate things, so he turns up now and then in different expansions as part of the Explorers League. He warns the Alliance and the Horde about the Titan constructs awakening in Ulduar, and the old god imprisoned there. Earlier I mentioned the Sons of Hodir, and here we see a few of them, dead and frozen, along with some dwarves who appeared to be in combat with the giants. This frozen battlefield, the nearby Ice Lake, and Fiery Anvil are all locations I visited doing daily quests to increase my reputation with the Sons of Hodir, who were based just on the edge of the Ice Lake. At the time, they offered one of the most valuable mounts in the game, the Traveler's Tundra Mammoth, which was not only a 3-seater ground mount, but also came with a repair vendor in one of the seats. Many people still use this even in modern times. It came at a steep cost though, 20,000 gold or 16,000 if you could wait until Exalted to buy it. In modern times that might not seem like much, but back then, it represented maybe 6 months of farming max-level gold farms. Scattered throughout the Storm Peaks are a few Titan Keeper rooms only accessible by flying through the openings on the sides of mountains. Those kinds of things are nice to see, giving more purpose to flying beyond just going fast. To unlock the Sons of Hodir reputation, players had to first go through a quest line to infiltrate Brunhilde village and disguise themselves as a female Frost Vrykul, before they could finally speak with the Sons of Hodir. If you ever wanted to ride a polar bear mount, you could stick with the women for a bit longer than necessary to buy it. As far as I recall, once you start helping the Sons of Hoddir, you can no longer be friendly to Brunhilde, but someone can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. In the plains below the village, there are some kobolds and Magnetor attacking a goblin encampment, but they can't make it past the landmines and electric turrets. If you land among the mines, you'll be pushed up into the air and suffer damage. If you can't escape quickly, you could end up being juggled until you die. That's less of a risk now, but back when this was current content, the damage those mines did was close to a fifth of your health bar even as a tank paladin. Continuing on, we have frozen rivers and frozen waterfalls throughout the zone, as well as this giant hole near the middle of the map. It intrigued me so much before I could fly to see what was down there. And there's Cretius, who seems pretty similar to the stone guys from Dragonflight, whom I haven't learned the name of yet. Exploring down the hole, it looks almost like the Titan Keepers are causing some of the frost here. On the other side of Storm Peaks is Zuldrak. Similar to Zulaman and Zul'Gurub, this is a troll empire, although much of it has already been taken over by the undead, and some of the trolls are willingly working with the undead in exchange for power. We can see some enchanted tiki warriors here, which if I recall are actually humanoid but invisible except for their spears and tiki masks. The main dungeon in the area is Gundrak, and I find it interesting how troll architecture includes depictions of faces so often. It reminds me a lot of Aztec architecture, and that might be intentional, even though the trolls speak with Jamaican accents in-game. In the courtyard above the dungeon there's this giant rhino being controlled by some trolls, showcasing how these trolls are forcefully commanding the animals and elements instead of cooperatively working with them. Up the stairs are some brutes, big hulking muscular trolls. As with the similar-looking orcs on Draenor, these two are artificially mutated. I wonder if Garrosh took the knowledge of how to create him to Draenor, or if the orcs living in Azeroth brought the knowledge from Outland. It would be too much of a coincidence for a mutation drug to create this body shape to be invented on two different planets within a few decades of each other. I was curious about Mammotuth Crater, but I still haven't looked it up. The trolls of Zuldrak have aqueducts distributing water to their crops. I find it interesting that instead of sloping the ducts downward, they had waterfalls built in. I think that causes excess evaporation even if no water is lost from splashing, but the area seems humid enough that it isn't an issue for them. The water elementals seem to like the splashing near the crops. Somewhere on the main road is a really big undead golem. I think I can find him if I fly around for a bit. Thrym, each of his feet is larger than my entire mount. I guess it is a good thing we don't have collision damage in this game, otherwise he'd step on me. He seems intimidating, but if he ever tries to follow you, you can usually run away faster than he can chase you. East of Zuldrak is the Grizzly Hills, full of incredibly tall trees, and people chopping them down. Dotted around the zone are these pelt-covered wooden watchtowers, which can act as landmarks if you get lost in the forest. Some of them have traps nearby like this hanging spiky log, which reminds me of when the Star Wars chicken walkers were attacked by logs on ropes. There are some troll ruins in the forest, indicating that Zuldrak may have tried to expand into the forest ages ago. Further into the cliffs, we can see metal dwarves in their citadels, with statues that are very close in architecture to Ironforge. Despite the eons since the Curse of Flesh began on Azeroth, the various subspecies of dwarf still share very much of their technology and architecture across the planet. In the Boulder Hills, recognizable rock giants from Warcraft 3, also known as cliff stompers, walk alongside run giants with trees on their backs. The silvercoat stag on the cliff's edge is something that breaks the immersion for me. I can't help but notice it is a recolor of the same art used on so many deer mobs from vanilla World of Warcraft. I do think they push out expansions too frequently and don't have the time to devote to unique art for each new asset in the game. I notice it a lot more with icons and loot. It seems like the same 100 or so icons just keep getting reused for everything. So many of the spell icons are reused from Warcraft 3. So many pet battle icons are used for multiple abilities. Sometimes it is really egregious. The pet anomalous can have 2 different abilities in its loadout at the same time with the same icon. On the other hand, sometimes there are too many icons that all mean the same thing, like all the variety of things that just mean 5 anima or 35 anima in Shadowlands. Near the coast here is Shadowfang Tower, where you can see the shade of Arugul. Arugul, before he died and came back as a ghost, was in Shadowfang Keep near Gilneas as the guy who helped summon the Worgen from the Emerald Dream into Azeroth. Near the border between Grizzly Hills and Howling Fjord, there are more dwarven structures and statues. If I may go off on another tangent, I'd like to talk about the timeline of the Scourge. Exact dates and years can be blurry in the Warcraft lore, but most people set the year 0 as the year the Dark Portal opened and first allowed orcs onto Azeroth, setting off the events of the Warcraft 1 game. Ner'zhul, the first Lich King, was an orc who was part of the leadership of the First Horde, along with Blackhand. When Gul'dan took control over the Horde and power shifted to Ogaram Doomhammer during Warcraft 2, Ner'zhul was still alive. When the portals turned Draenor into Outland, that's when Ner'zhul was taken by the Burning Legion and punished for his failures by being transformed into the first Lich King. I think this happened around year 6 or 7. It took him some time to master his new magical abilities and begin commanding the dead. Then the War of the Spider happened, where he killed Anub'arak and started using undead Nerubians. Around year 18 was when Kel'Thuzad travelled to Northrend and was coerced into founding the Cult of the Damned in Lordaeron. This was around the same time that Thrall was escaping from Durnhold Keep and founding the Free Horde. Year 20, as far as I can tell, is the events of Warcraft 3. Then vanilla World of Warcraft happened in year 24, the Burning Crusade in year 25, the Wrath of the Lich King in year 26, and Cataclysm in year 28. Knowing the timeline really puts some things into perspective and they make more sense. Like, why are there still living Nerubians after the War of the Spider? Because it has been less than 20 years. Why are there still dwarves, trolls, Vrykul, dragons, and Tuskar in Northrend who haven't been converted into Scourge? Because the Lich King thought it was easier to grow an army of undead humans fed plagued grain rather than trying to conquer fortified positions. If it took Arthas nearly 6 years to mentally battle Ner'zhul and gain control over the Scourge after he put on the helmet, then maybe it took Ner'zhul 6 years to begin the Scourge after being imprisoned in the helmet? If so, the War of the Spider would have happened around year 12. Who knows how long that war lasted, or when the Scourge incorporated the giant skeletons, abominations, plague apothecaries, gargoyles, and banshees. We can assume that human necromancers, acolytes, meat wagons, liches, skeletal horses, skeletal griffins, and plagued grain were all added between year 18 and 20. We know that Arthas was the first Death Knight, not counting the Orc Death Knights serving Gul'dan and the Burning Legion, since they were a different style of being. Which implies that the other Death Knights were created during the time that Arthas and Ner'zhul were vying for control within the helmet. That would explain how so many of them were able to assert their own free will. We also know that Saphion was the first undead dragon, created by Arthas on his way to the Frozen Throne to merge with Ner'zhul, which explains why there aren't too many of them around. When I first played World of Warcraft, I was unaware of the timeline, and was confused why so much of Northrend was filled with life, either natural beasts and plants, or organized civilizations of living intelligent creatures. Now knowing how short Ner'zhul's and Arthas's reigns were, it makes much more sense. However, it opens up a new question about Bolvar. Why must there always be a Lich King? Couldn't we dispel the necromantic magics and return the skeletons and zombies to rest, or free them like Sylvanas did for Nathanos and others raised by the Valkyr? Anyway, back on topic, Grizzly Hills is also home to the stump of Vordrassil, which used to be a world tree similar to Teldrassil, Nordrassil, and Shaladrassil. Vordrassil used to be called Andrassil, and was grown from a branch of Nordrassil in an attempt to block up the influence of the old gods in Northrend, but when it succumbed to the infection, the Druids tore it down and renamed it. Nordrassil atop Mount Hyjal was utilized to defeat Archimonde in Warcraft 3, along with many wisps, also known as Night Elf ghosts. It did regrow, but the Night Elves' immortality, which was empowered by the first Nordrassil, did not return. Teldrassil is the tree off the western coast of Kalimdor that the Night Elves made their home until it was burned by Sylvanas during the battle for Azeroth. Shaladrassil in the Broken Isles was corrupted by the Emerald Nightmare. If the Druids didn't cut down Vordrassil, it may have met the same fate. Two rival tribes of Furbolg compete over the stump and surrounding areas. Ever since Warcraft 3, I've always liked Furbolgs. I always do the optional quests to help them whenever I replay that game. There's a clan of them on the border of Winterspring, Moonglade, and Felwood in Kalimdor that players can befriend, which I remember getting to Exalted on my old account, but haven't put the time into for my current World of Warcraft account. On my way down the river, I got distracted by this nice-looking log bridge. It has little vines and mushrooms and flowers and ground cover plants growing all over it. A very stark comparison to the undead lands not far away. Near the coast here we can see how it isn't just the Venture Co chopping down the forest, but also the Horde and Alliance. These stumps and lumber mills are a PvP mini-zone, similar to the towers in Hellfire Peninsula and Terokar Forest in Outland. There are also plenty of pirates along the coast. Why they chose to follow the Horde and Alliance here, or why they would be here beforehand, is anyone's guess. If you go through some of the narrow ravines, you can see basic wooden plank bridges, some of which are broken or hanging in pieces. Overlooking the rivers are more Vrykul settlements. Speaking of which, there is one that is partially converted into Scourge. This continues a long-running trend of the Lich King and his servants using manipulation and sometimes mind control of the living to bolster their ranks. I remember playing Warcraft 3 and using the Banshees to possess enemy units, especially unique ones like bandits and furbolgs and I think ogres. I was ecstatic when Sylvanas leveled up enough to get the charm spell, which was like the Banshee possession, but didn't consume the caster. I purposefully drew out and delayed missions so I could use that ability on its cooldown to grab as many things as possible. There was even a Sasquatch in one level. It felt really cool, like I was able to do things the game didn't anticipate, almost like cheating. I'll definitely be replaying that game soon. Maybe I'll even record it if people want to see how I play through the campaign. Don't mind the ember clutch, just a burning bit of forest. We've seen things like that before that somehow don't spread to the nearby trees. Remember that bit in Terokar Forest? Yeah, same thing here. But you know what we didn't have in Outland? Gondola lifts like this one leading down to another Tuskar village. I keep looking around trying to find any female Tuskar, but I don't think the different appearances were as pronounced here as they become later on in the Dragon Isles. If we go south, we can see two beaches facing each other, one with reef cows, and the other with reef bulls. There is a quest to grab a bunch of fish and lure a bull toward the cows so they can have hearts appear in the air, if you know what I mean. Also, on the Bull Island, there are more pirates, and these ones you can actually do quests for once you meet the requirements. Back on the mainland, there are a few lift elevators with artistically carved tops. They used to help players a lot before flying became so accessible, and now can still be used for the scenic route. The small Vrykul village of Halgrind is being experimented on by the Forsaken Plague Apothecaries. If you happen to quest through Howling Fjord before getting to Dragonblight, then there's some foreshadowing for what happens at the Wrathgate. I, however, saw this afterwards. As both Horde and Alliance, I started in Borean Tundra, which led me to Dragonblight and Sholazar Basin. Both factions could start in Howling Fjord, I just didn't. Moving on, we can see what many of the rivers in the zone lead to, Utgard Pinnacle and Utgard Keep. Two dungeons in the same building, with some really huge skull motifs carved into the side. Near the base of the keep is an Alliance base camp, and if we follow this path out to sea, we fly past a flaming shipwreck in midair, held aloft by chains anchored into the cliff walls. The Horde base camp is on the eastern coast, but before we get there, we pass by Bielgun's excavation site, with a Titan construct-looking statue being excavated out of the cliffside. Another great lift can take you out to a smaller excavation site that looks suspiciously like a reference to Planet of the Apes, with the Statue of Liberty torch and hand poking out of the ground. There are some odd-looking relatives of deer here, very creatively called shovel tusk. Kind of like a unibrow moose with elephant tusks that flatten out in antler style at the tips. Our trip is coming to a close, but there are a couple more places I want to show you. We started out in Dalaran, but you may not have truly taken in the vibrant purple and white trees of Crystal Song Forest. I can also show you how to enter the Dalaran sewers without going through the city first. This convenient pipe leads right in. If you can't find it, look for the purple magic shield on the ground, where a mage offers to teleport you up to the city, and fly pretty much straight up from there. Back in Icecrown, did you know you can land on those zeppelins flying around? There's one for Horde and one for Alliance, and they have a bunch of quests, but sometimes finding the moving floating hub can be tedious. I probably could have shown you this next part when we were doing the main tour of Icecrown, but I reserved it for last because a lot of people never go there during their gaming. You can barely see it on the map, and it has a few krakens in the water leading up to it, but this is the furthest north place in Azeroth, as far as we know. Hrothgar's Landing is populated mostly by Kavaldir, the undead Vrykul covered in kelp, but we can see signs that this wasn't always the case. Near the top of the hill there are more of those Tuskar Easter Island head statues that we've seen in Borean Tundra. If we fly around this little island, risking fatigue a little bit, we can see both Icecrown Citadel and Ulduar in the distance in different directions. And that, my friends, concludes the tour of Northrend. I'm still working on the Dungeons and Dragons videos. Depending on timing, you may have already seen the first chapter before this video releases. Please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I do read all the comments and plan to continue as long as I can.